This is part 2 of unemployment. So no longer looking at natural unemployment, but looking at disequilibrium unemployment, cyclical, which is demand deficient, and classical, which is real wage unemployment. So what if there's too much supply of labor and not enough demand? Disequilibrium unemployment. Let's look at first cyclical or demand deficient unemployment. So let's look at a recessionary gap. Now, a reminder, recessionary gap is when there is a lack of aggregate demand and AD has shifted left. So we're going to look at the scenario that AD has already shifted left, and what does this look like? Aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and sorry, I forgot to label the axes, so real GDP, and the price level. And the point of intersection is to the left of the LAS. The LAS being where we have the natural rate of unemployment. So unemployment now consists of additional unemployment over and above the natural rate of unemployment. So if we look at our output, it is to the left of the natural rate of unemployment. So unemployment in a recessionary gap. So we drew the recessionary gap there. We can call this cyclical or demand deficient unemployment. Demand deficient because there's a lack of aggregate demand. It's referred to as cyclical because if you think of the business cycle, we're on a downward section or where the economy is contracting. So cyclical or demand deficient unemployment is when the cyclical nature of the macroeconomy is moving downwards, and so labor is not required in such large amounts. It is associated with levels of aggregate demand below full employment, meaning that we have a deflationary gap. Cyclical unemployment is seen to arise from a lack of aggregate demand. And so the government may take measures to increase aggregate demand. So what could they do? If we're looking at monetary measures, they could, of course, lower interest rates. If we're looking at fiscal measures, they could lower personal and corporate taxes, and they could increase government spending. So unemployment in a recessionary gap. Let's look at both the neoclassical model and the Keynesian model. Again, really wowing the IB examiners. So we'll label the axes, real GDP, and the price level. And so if we're showing an initial deflationary or recessionary gap, show AD, AD1, SAS, LAS, natural rate of unemployment. And so what would we do to eliminate this? We want to stimulate, so we're operating at this point here. We want to stimulate aggregate demand, shifting AD over here, AD2, so we're moving from point A over to point B. So we've eliminated the recessionary gap. If we're dealing with the Keynesian model, again, real GDP and price level, horizontal part of the SAS curve, and then becoming vertical. So if we had a deflationary gap where aggregate demand is operating here, we're going to want to shift it so we're getting to the vertical point of the curve, ED2, and we've shifted aggregate demand over to this point where we are at now a full level of employment. So again, if you wanted to show how you could fix cyclical or demand deficient unemployment, it would be fantastic to use both the neoclassical and the Keynesian model. So let's look at a different unemployment, the classical or real wage unemployment. If for some reason the wage rate rises above the equilibrium, then some unemployment will arise. This would be known as real wage or classical unemployment. It is also known as disequilibrium unemployment and is illustrated on the next slide. So here we are using the axes, labeling the axes employment and the wage level. So we had aggregate demand for labor and a short run aggregate supply for labor. So here we have supply of labor and here we have demand for labor. The equilibrium rate would of course be here. If for some reason wages have increased to up here to Y2, I mean W2, we would have a real wage unemployment. So for some reason, wages are too high above the equilibrium, and because of that, we have a lack of demand for labor, but more of a supply for labor, resulting in this real wage unemployment. Classical or real wage unemployment measures to deal with it involve eliminating minimum wage legislation, if that happens to be the problem that minimum wage is too high, and or reducing the power of labor unions who may have driven up wages beyond the market equilibrium. So let's look at an ADAS model showing the impact of reducing this type of unemployment through lower wages and reduced unions. So first of all, if we are going to reduce wages, then our cost of production has decreased. And if the cost of production is decreased, we then know that it's SAS that is going to have shifted, to the right. So first we'll show the scenario of what's going on. So we'll call this real GDP and the price level. AD1, SAS1, LAS, natural rate of unemployment. We're starting off at this point here, and now we are reducing wages, so reducing the cost of production. And so it is SAS, excuse me, it should be intersecting here, SAS that is shifting to the right with lower wages. And we've returned to the natural rate of unemployment. So this is our point A ending up at point B. So just a reminder, what are the 5 types of unemployment? If we're looking at the natural rate of unemployment, it's composed of structural, frictional, and seasonal unemployment. The disequilibrium unemployment is known as cyclical, or demand deficient. Or classic or real wage unemployment. So let's see these 5 types of unemployment on this graph. So here we've got cyclical and real wage to the left. In addition to the natural rate of unemployment, so plus structural, plus frictional, plus seasonal. Here we're dealing with the natural rate of unemployment. So we're dealing with the structural plus frictional plus seasonal unemployment. And to the right, we're dealing with, we have no real wage, or cyclical unemployment. We have unemployment that's below the natural rate of unemployment. So unemployment less than the natural rate of unemployment. And the reason why is a portion of frictional, seasonal, and structural unemployed find temporary employment. So portion of structural, frictional, and seasonal unemployed find temporary employment. Okay, so let's look at some testers, particularly important if you are higher level. So first of all, we're looking at calculating the number of unemployed people. So the unemployment rate is going to equal the number of unemployed over the labor force. And so what are we looking for? We're looking for the number of unemployed people. So this is our unknown. We'll let that be X. So we've got, and rearranging the formula, we'll have number of unemployed cross multiplying. So this is over 1 and we're cross multiplying now. Excuse me, number of unemployed. So the number of unemployed is going to equal the labor force times the unemployment rate. So we have 1,192,000 times 0.055, which equals 65,560. Okay, so now we're asked to look for the unemployment rate, which is going to be number, of unemployed over the labor force. And because we're dealing with a rate, we're going to multiply by 100. So the numbers we're dealing with which ends up being 6.2, sorry about the 6.2%. And don't forget the percentage because we're looking at it as a rate. Okay, so again, we've got and again, don't forget, because it's a rate, we're going to multiply by 100. And so we know that 52% is the same thing as 0.052. So we've got 0.052 equals our unknown over our labor force. Again, cross multiplying. Or we could either say 3.25 million, or expand this out to be individuals. Okay, so some testers, true or false. Policymakers aim at lowering unemployment to as close as 0% as possible. Well, we know that to be false, because a healthy, functioning economy really does not want to get rid of seasonal, frictional, and structural unemployment. Structural unemployment tends to be of short-term nature. Again, false. We know that it's a mismatch of skills. So a whole set of skills has to be built up, or a mismatch of geography. So people or firms have to be moved. And this tends to not be short-term. Some frictional unemployment is unavoidable. This is true because we will have people that are in between jobs, or who have been fired, or want to improve their skills and find perhaps a better job. If unemployment decreases, then the PPF will shift outwards. Well, this one's going to depend. It's going to depend on if you are dealing with unemployment that's within the production possibility frontier. Maybe it's just simply moved to another point within. Or perhaps you have indeed increased the potential GDP or potential output of an economy. Depends on what the situation is. The LAS curve of an economy will shift to the right if cyclical unemployment decreases. This is false. If cyclical unemployment decreases, we're simply reducing the deflationary gap and moving back to the natural rate of unemployment. The LAS curve of the economy will shift to the right if structural and frictional unemployment decreases. Again, I'm going to say it depends. And it depends if, have we got a permanent change? Then the answer would be yes. Or is it a temporary change? And the answer would be no. Some further testers. What kind of employment is this? So this is real wage or disequilibrium unemployment. Also known as classical unemployment. We've got, for some reason, the wages are too high and they're not at the equilibrium, resulting in real wage unemployment. In terms of here, of closing a recessionary gap, we've got demand deficient, which is also known as cyclical unemployment. And here, if we have people who have gone back to school to improve their level of skill so they can move up and find a better job, we would call this frictional unemployment. And here our Star Wars figure is without his starship. So this one is structural unemployment. And our last unemployment, summer gnomes in winter, nowhere to go. This one, of course, would be seasonal unemployment. Thank you.